Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to start our conversation about emotions. This is a two-part lecture. The first lecture, what we're going to have now, is going to be discussing expressing emotions, and then our next lecture will be about interpreting emotions. So, as we talk about expressing emotions, we're going to start by discussing this really interesting element that we call universal emotions. And the idea behind universal emotions, this has been studied extensively by psychologists, is that we all share the same basic universal emotions. In fact, I would guess that you could look at this image that I have on the screen and you could write little brief descriptors about each of those facial expressions and have a pretty good idea of the emotions that are being portrayed. We have anger, happy, disgust, shocked, sad, and fearful, right? And those are probably similar to the descriptions that you would use as well. Well, these universal emotions are shared and across the globe. It doesn't matter where you're from, what country you're from, what era you live in, whether you're alive now or you were alive 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. We have these same basic universal emotions, and the way that they are distinguished are by our face and the muscles in our face. We have 42 muscles in our face that allow us to have these different distinguishable uh, facial features and express these emotions. And this is important because we can communicate with others even without using language the emotions that we feel. This is something we're born with. It is innate to be able to communicate our emotions with our faces. And we know that it's inborn, for example. We know it's not something that you learn through observation, even as an infant, because we can study people who are visually impaired, someone who's never seen an angry face before. They still show a similar angry face when they experience that emotion. And why is this important? Well, again, it's important that we can communicate emotions with people even if we can't communicate using language. I like to give the analogy, let's say you're walking down the street and you see someone and they're smiling and they're happy and they're kind of running towards you. Well, you would likely run toward them and embrace them in a hug, and hopefully this is someone you know. Whereas if someone is running towards you and their face is frightened, you will likely run in the same direction as them. You're not sure why they are running, but something is a threat, and so it's time to get out of there. And if someone is running at you and they're angry, you're probably going to run away from that person because trouble is ahead and they may be trying to hurt you or something. So it's important that we can not only express these facial features and these universal emotions, but we can pick up on them as well. Looking into kind of our brain and how our brain helps us express different emotions. The first kind of term I have there is a little bit of review. We discussed the amygdala in Unit 2 when we talked about biopsych. And my helpful hint for students is if you are ever given a multiple choice question about emotions and amygdala is an option, pick it. It's hands down the most commonly asked term in regard to emotions and the brain on the AP psychology exam. So you want to tie those things together. Just think if the question's about emotions and you can choose amygdala, that's a really good guess. It's not necessarily going to be the right answer. It's possible that it won't be, but it's a really good guess. The amygdala helps with the expression of strong emotions, particularly emotions like anger and fear. We know some interesting things can happen if we start to manipulate with the amygdala. For example, if we stimulate the amygdala of a lab rat, the lab rat will become quite violent and start to, fight other rats in the cage. Whereas if we remove the amygdala from a lab rat, the rat will be calm and docile. In fact, the rat won't show any fear, even in situations where a lab rat should show fear. It doesn't if that amygdala has been removed. The cingulate cortex is a new term for you. I have in the image down there kind of where you can find the cingulate cortex, and you'll see that the cingulate cortex builds this bridge between our cortex, which we discussed, think your two hemispheres and the lobes of your brain, where we do a lot of critical thinking, and subcortical structures, right? The cortex and subcortical structures. And the subcortical structures are where we have things like strong emotions and memory. And so the cingulate cortex ties these things together, it's the bridge between them all. And because of that, the cingulate cortex allows us to put value on the quality of different types of emotions, particularly things like fear and pain. And so there are different types of pain that we experience. And the cingulate cortex helps us differentiate between, let's say, some kind of physical pain and some kind of psychological or emotional pain. People who have an overactive cingulate cortex, they may experience irrational fear. They may be more likely to worry and be anxious, as there appears to be a disruption between the emotional part of our brain, kind of the subcortical structures, and our rational thinking logical cortex. The basal ganglia, a little bit of review. Remember, those are small motor control that may help you with this. The basal ganglia is very active during the emotion of disgust. And if we think about that particular emotion, disgust, disgust is an emotion that we have to help protect us, to help us survive, where we are literally pulling ourselves away from something that may be dangerous, right? If we think about that emotion of disgust and kind of what that looks like, well, sometimes we show this emotion for things that are physical. You bite into some food that has gone bad, is spoiled, or maybe you bite into a fruit or a plant of some sort that's bitter or poisonous. Well, we have this emotion of disgust of, I need to get away from this, it might hurt me. We show the same emotion of disgust when someone says something that we consider to be offensive, and we want to kind of distance ourselves from that comment. Well, your basal ganglia is very active during that process. And then I have up there left and right hemispheres. There's still research to be done on this, but one thing that we have found is that your left hemisphere tends to be a little more active when we are processing positive emotions like joy and love, whereas your right hemisphere appears to be more active when we process more negative emotions such as jealousy and anger and things like that. As far as cultural influences on emotion, it's important to know that although we have these universal emotions, regardless of where you are in the world, you still experience fear, you still experience, happiness, that there are cultural influences on emotions. And so, for example, we can categorize emotions. I have there, Tahitians don't have a word for sadness. It's not that Tahitians don't experience sadness, but the fact that they don't have a word for that category means in essence that they experience it differently. Think about when we discussed language development, and we talked about how much our language impacts the way that we think and the way that we feel. Germans, for example, have a very specific word to describe the joy that we experience by watching someone else fail. And you've maybe experienced that, right? It's kind of a weird thing to verbalize, but if you watch someone fail at a task and that brings you pleasure, like if I watch Philip Rivers throw an interception, I get great joy out of it. Even if he's not playing the Chiefs, I still get great joy out of this experience, right? Well, we don't have a word for that, but it doesn't mean we don't experience the emotion. And so the way that we categorize emotions can impact the way that they're expressed and experienced. Primary emotions. I'm not going to have you do this, through a recorded lecture, but imagine that I asked you to list out, the 10 emotions that you've experienced in the last week or so. And so you kind of reflect back on today and then the past few days, and you're writing out different emotions that you have felt. Well, it's possible that you have felt shame. That's certainly an emotion that we experience in the United States, but it's not a primary emotion, meaning it's not something that I would expect most students to write on a normal average week. Because shame, although we experience it, isn't a primary emotion in the United States. Jealousy, however, is. So you're much more likely to write jealousy on your piece of paper of emotions that you have felt in the past week as opposed to shame. Whereas you compare this more, individualistic culture that we have here to a more collectivistic culture, let's say in a place in Eastern Asia, well, it would be much more likely that, someone living in Japan would write shame and would not necessarily write jealousy. So primary emotions are going to change depending on where you live and your different culture. And then the way that we express emotions beyond simply our facial features also differs depending on culture. And so some European countries, for example, will have people go up and kiss each other on the cheek to express, a welcoming greeting. The way that we express gratitude depends on our culture. Even something as simple as expressing pleasure of like, hey, this is great, I love this lecture. Well, this kind of okay symbol in the United States, you got to be careful if you hold this up in other parts of the world, right? If you go to Australia and you hold up the okay symbol, that means something very different than, hey, everything's a okay. And so the way that we express our emotions using, our hands and our body, that differs depending on your culture as well. And then finally, our last slide for this lecture is this idea of facial and behavioral feedback. So I want you to think about this for a moment, okay? When you are really happy and you are around your friends, maybe you're watching a funny TV show, you're probably laughing and smiling. Well, do you think it's possible if I forced you to smile, if I did something that forced you to smile and forced you to laugh, that you could almost trick your brain into believing I must be in a good mood? After all these muscles in my face are telling me that I'm smiling. Well, that's the theory behind facial and behavior feedback, that we can trick our minds into believing we are experiencing a particular emotion by mimicking the way that our face and our body reacts when we naturally feel those emotions. And let me give you a couple of examples. So, some psychologists did this really interesting experiment where they had people come in and they rate their emotion. And then the control group were asked to essentially sit there for about 20 minutes and then rate their emotions again. Whereas the experimental group, they were given a pen and they were told to hold the pen in their teeth for 20 minutes. And as they sat there holding the pen in their teeth for 20 minutes, it forces this exact same muscles that we would tend to see being used in a smile. And when these people rated their emotion, sure enough, they felt better. Now, it could be, right? Skeptics would argue that maybe they felt better because they were participating in some silly experiment. And that's a legitimate, skepticism. That's a legitimate concern to the research. In fact, some of this research struggles when it comes to reliability, repeating the research and getting similar results. There was another interesting study on facial feedback where they took these kind of golf tees and they attached them to people's foreheads using this special kind of glue, and they were told, these people, to touch the ends of the golf tees together. Well, if you have these two golf tees sticking out of your forehead and you want the ends of the golf tees to come together, you kind of have to do this. You have to mimic what it would look like to be frustrated or upset. And sure enough, these people rated being more frustrated and upset. Of course, I would say I would too if someone glued some golf tees to my forehead, right? And then behavior feedback is the same thing as facial feedback, only we're talking now the whole body. And so they had participants, for example, go out to a track, and the control group were just told to walk around the track normally and then rate how they feel after they've been out there walking around. And then they had one group have these kind of shuffling steps and their shoulders hunched forward. And then a third group, shoulders back, big strides, arms swinging. And they had people rate how they felt. And it's what you would expect. The people who had their heads down and were shuffling with their steps, they felt more upset than those people in the control group, and significantly less happy than those with the big strides and their shoulders back. So maybe this whole idea of fake it until you make it works. But do keep in mind there is some criticism on the reliability of these types of studies of facial feedback and behavioral feedback. All right, that does it for emotional expression. Next lecture will be interpreting these emotions. If you have any questions, I encourage you to reach out to me. Otherwise, as always, good luck, everyone.